There is a stigma with the opioid epidemic that involves a lot of assumptions and prejudgments of its underlying causes. My name is Alyssa, and I want to talk about how prevalent this epidemic is in today's society. Not here to say we can solve this easily, but I want to inform more people about the problem and how we can help, while also talking about the economics behind it and the reason for why so much money is put into this problem. So what are opiates? The term opiate and opioid come from the opium poppy, which can be used for medicinal properties, and it has been cultivated in human societies for thousands of years. From this opium, people derived a whole host of other drugs with similar properties. Now let's go over the differences between opiates and opioids. The terms are used interchangeably, but typically opiates are the substances that are very similar to the actual poppy plant and have the same effects. Some examples of opiates include morphine, codeine, and heroin. These substances are made from the plant and are a bit different than the synthetic drugs that also can be made. Which brings us to opiates. It is similar to opium in its effect, but not so much chemical composition, meaning it's chemically different from the opium plant, but still acts on the opioid receptors in the brain, just like opiates. Examples of opioids are these powerful painkillers such as oxycodone, methadone, and fentanyl. Most of these are given through a prescription, but regardless of whether it is an opiate or an opioid, it still has the ability to be abused. This next slide shows just how bad the problem is. As you can see, America is way more than the other countries. Over 97 million people took prescription painkillers in 2015. Of these, 12 million did so without being directed by a doctor. As you can see, for America, it is one of our biggest problems. This next slide is some facts on opioids. It's absolutely mind-blowing, some of these stats. 160 people died every day from opioid-related overdoses. 2.1 million had an opioid use disorder, and $504 billion in economic costs. This was also part of my infographic, showing the different ages of users. It is hitting young adults the hardest. In fact, nearly 1 in 20 high school students have taken Vicodin, and the number of opioids prescribed to young adults doubled between 1994 and 2007. This graph is showing the rising sales of prescription painkillers correlating with exactly with death and substance abuse treatment admissions. All of these are increasing, and they continue to increase, as you saw in the previous slides, of the $504 billion in economic costs. Moving into the economics of this issue, lost wages and productivity resulting from death and incarceration of this crisis is roughly estimated at about $40 billion annually. The opioid crisis is a huge factor in contributing to decreased productivity in the workforce. While there are a number of studies that attempt to measure the economic losses from this crisis, the CEA argues that people are undervaluing the most important one, which is the fatalities from overdoses that involve opioids. Studies on economic cost are mainly healthcare costs. In fact, opioid overdose abuse and dependence cost $78.5 billion in 2013. 70% of that was healthcare spending, criminal justice, and lost productivity due to addiction and incarceration. That remaining 30% was attributed to fatality costs, consisting almost entirely of lost potential earnings. But some of these estimates are only a partial account of the damage imposed by this epidemic. Not all opioid deaths are accounted for, and it has worsened over the years with an increasing role of heroin use. But we have to think about the costs that are non-fatal. This includes increases in healthcare and substance abuse treatment, increases in criminal justice costs, and reduced productivity among those who did not die. This totals $72.3 billion in non-fatal costs. All of these data and statistics comes from the CEA. The CEA is the Council of Economic Advisors, which is an agency within the Executive Office of the President. In October 2017, the opioid epidemic was declared a national public health emergency. But what are they doing? More than $1 billion in funding has been allocated or spent directly addressing the drug addiction and the opioid crisis. $9 million of that was used to enhance border security and hire more personnel to advance the fight against opioids. But what can we do? I think mainly we need to be less judgmental about drug addiction and reduce the stigma that comes with it, by not discouraging addicts, but by being optimistic and reassuring that there are ways to get help. Finding solutions is not exclusive to public officials and law enforcement officers. Rather, us, with public awareness, becoming proactive through activism, and even just becoming more educated about this epidemic can help greatly. I'm sure you or someone you know has been affected by this epidemic, and there are events happening across the country by not only fundraising for others to gain access to addiction treatment, but events celebrating recovery and people's sobriety. Thank you for listening, and this is my works cited.